Okay. Yep. Okay. So good morning, everyone. And I am absolutely delighted to be visiting, well, even if it is remote visiting, you all in Ireland today. I'm based in the United Arab Emirates, and it's just gone 2 o'clock in the afternoon here. I also want to obviously thank the organisers for this. I think it is an important subject, and I guess that we've all signed up for that very reason. I'll just tell you a bit about some other housekeeping information before we make a start. In addition to what Mirren has said, there won't be any breakout groups, because I think sometimes when you have breakout groups in Zoom, you just get disconnected and people can't find themselves. So what we'll do when we get to those areas of discussion is I'll open the floor and you can use the chat function, or you can raise your hand, Mirren, and hopefully Paula will be keeping an eye on and inviting people to ask questions. But the plan is to make at least half an hour or 20 minutes right at the end for those discussions. We recognize that we're all here for learning purposes, and what we are sharing and hearing will not be shared outside these, well, I don't want to call them four walls even, but they won't be shared outside this forum. However, sometimes the recording or the recording may include information we don't want shared outside, hence why Mirren's going to look at and listen to them again and ensure that everyone's happy or she's happy before the recording is released. So I think this makes for a good way to start the conversation. But also I will skip elements of the introduction about me, because Mirren has provided that. What I do want to emphasize are 2 points on this slide, which are, one, that I hold the old Practice Teaching Award. And of course, I'm talking from an English perspective, where we're now practice educators. And so the current award is the Practice Educator Award. But what I have is the old, as they call it, Practice Teachers Award, which I gained in 2005. And more importantly for me is I'm currently a practice educator for a Scottish university student, should I say, who's based in Dubai. So I think the potential for practice education globally is endless. The potential for innovation and different ways of delivering a practice curriculum are growing and changing. And so this feels like the best time to revisit these conversations about anti-oppressive practice. And so we're going to be doing that today. And I don't make any apologies for a slight emphasis on race and race oppression. And that's because that's my area of expertise. You'll see from here that my doctorate, actually, the thesis was around practice learning experiences of Black African students on social work programs in England. So there is that key area of my knowledge that I don't want to lose, and I don't want to make apologies for, but I look at a wider anti-oppressive framework as well in the training that, or the discussion that we're going to be having today. So I guess the aims for me today in consultation with Mirren are around demonstrating how we might be able to use a tool that I developed known as the Mandela model. How might we use that as a tool for anti-oppressive practice? So that's one area. I think we need to really reflect on power within the supervisory relationship. I think that's absolutely important and central to any discussion around oppression. And then finally, I think we're going to try and consider what some of the enablers and barriers might be to anti-oppressive practice education. Okay, so I know that I'm not attempting to teach anyone to suck eggs, and I don't want to appear as belittling or undermining what you already know, but I feel that when we are talking about things like this, we have to state the obvious. It is when you don't state the obvious that you start to make assumptions, I think. So I know that in terms of the literature, that social work training increasingly is attracting a diverse range of students, and I suspect that will be the case in Ireland. Occasionally, when I stop for the discussion, please feel free to share with me whether your views are, whether the situation in Ireland is different or similar to what I've been discussing. So Fletcher and colleagues have argued, though, that although there has been a recent change, if you like, an increase in diversity amongst students studying social work, they argue that those changes don't reflect the experiences of these diverse students. So yes, wonderful, you're letting all these diverse students in. We now have more LGBT students, more students with disability, more male students, more younger students, and so on and so forth. However, their journey appears to be quite different from everyone else. And so what is that about? So Fletcher and colleagues warn us right at the start that just a blanket view that things have become more diverse and things have become more inclusive does not equate to a more inclusive and a more diverse process and experience on social work programs. And certainly that was the case with this study, which was focused on England. But we know that from its inception, social work has, or the profession has, purported to value diversity, and the global definition that we all subscribe to actually does remind us of that. And because the workforce is made up of different people from different backgrounds, ages, genders, like I've said earlier, sexuality, and so on, we have to start thinking about how these are respected and valued all the way through from the application, the point that the student applies to join your program, to qualification and beyond. And you'll see why I'm saying that a bit later. Because the concern that we have as social workers is that as practitioners, we are very able and very skilled at working with our service users in ways that uphold anti-oppressive principles. But sometimes we don't see those principles as transferring easily to our interactions and our work with students. And that needs to be thought through. Now, whether they're students or people we manage or colleagues in teams, there has to be a way in which, as practitioners, we continue respecting those values to whichever and apply them across the board to whoever we're working with and or interacting with. So it's some of these kind of ideas and issues that brought me to this study today. But I also want to share with you some of the research that's behind this area for me. So I'm going to go right back to 2008, and at the end of the messages from research section, I will be asking you a question about the situation in Ireland. So if you want to start thinking about that, it would be useful. So as far back as 2008, again, this is within the UK, within England specifically, Hussein and colleagues reported that male students and students with disabilities, as well as Black and minority ethnic students, had poorer progression rates on social work programs than other groups. A year later, 2009, Bartoli et al., who incidentally, I am one of the et als, in 2009, our study found that students from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds reported less satisfaction with their practice learning experiences than other groups. Moving swiftly on to 2012, Finesse found that male students, as well as students from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, are more likely to fail placements than any other group. In 2011, the Bernard et al. Study, which I think Miriam and colleagues are familiar with, this is Professor Claudia Bernard in Goldsmiths University. Herself and her colleagues, they found that Black and minority ethnic students experience discrimination on placements, not just from service users, but also from colleagues, practice assessors, and other professionals. And the students in that study argued that it was these discriminatory experiences that that made the difference, if you like, between their experiences on social work programs and the white majority students. Sorry, there's quite a few of these, but you know, as you can see, I'm building the case here. In 2013, Anna Fertlow and colleagues wrote about gay and lesbian students experiencing discrimination on social work programs and on placements. So in 2014, that's me again, I reported the presence of racism. At this point, we're beginning to name some of these oppressive practices. I reported the presence of racism on placements and, sorry. Yeah, on placements. And I cited the example of one student of African heritage who informed me that she was out of the, her practice educator / manager was out of the office. She was in the office. A service user arrived. There was an urgent need for her to make contact with her practice educator. She argues that, or she suggests that her practice educator put the phone down on her, saying she did not understand her accent. So at this point, there's a complete, absolute disregard for what the purpose of that phone call was, which was, I'm a student, I'm here on my own, there's a service user, help, you know. So there's a disregard at that point. Kwali in 2017 talks more broadly about Black social work students' experiences, and that there was a kind of a negation of their cultural knowledge and forms in terms of, you know, in relation to other students, but again, particularly looking at placement experiences. Young and colleagues in 2019, they have a lovely study, a really interesting piece, if you can get hold of it, I've got the reference at the end. They investigated the experiences of practice educators, which is another area that's kind of, the literature around that's quite minimal, I'm sure you would agree. And so they spoke to practice educators who admitted that there were challenges that they came across when working with students from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So the Young et al. Study 2019 is actually one that I think is speaks on behalf of the practice educators. So if we want to move away from, oh, well, students are saying this, I think it's a really useful paper for anyone who is engaged in study around this. And just very recently, literally a month ago even, I again found that in terms of the COVID-19 and the pandemic, that suspended placements, differential treatment in relation to placements, and remote learning were experienced differently by Black African social work students that I studied. And again, when we look at how that manifests at the different stages, I'll probably be able to explain a bit more. You can imagine that whatever the situation that we had pre-COVID, COVID can only made it worse, or can only make it worse. And I think that that's something that we need to consider in terms of our own practice going forward. So I'm now moving on from a kind of an England-based research to kind of sharing what the messages from international research tell us about similar topics. So we've got Razak from Canada, 2001, again talked about relationship difficulties between field supervisors and students of ethnic minority backgrounds. A Scottish study by Hillen and colleagues talk about poorer experiences and outcomes for Black students. In 2013, coming from Australia, Harrison and Ip talk about poorer experiences by Aboriginal and minority students. In 2014, Gare and colleagues, again in Australia, talk about Aboriginal students' experiences of racism. And finally, in 2020, in Canada, Dubai and colleagues found that discrimination against minority students was sometimes framed as learning experiences. So I think from where I'm coming from, and I will be, asking in a minute, all of these pieces of research, of course, you will notice, as I said earlier, perhaps a slant towards race, but you can see what is emergent from all of the research that I've cited, local and international, is that this is the summary of research. The summary pertains to the fact that people of LGBTQIA perhaps backgrounds, male students, younger students, Black and minority ethnic students, and disabled students are disproportionately failing or experiencing social work education and social work practice learning differently to the majority of students on our programs. Whilst that is concerning, I do want us to take a moment to think about that while we reflect on this question here. and Miriam, I'll need your help at this point. It's kind of a pause for reflection. I mean, what does the literature reveal about the situation in Ireland? Is it similar or different to what I've just been sharing from the UK and elsewhere? And this is kind of take some time to think about this and offer some thoughts either in the chat or through audio. If you put your hand up, Miriam will identify.
Thanks, Prospera.
Yep.
Anyone like to contribute? I think, Prospera, one of the key things is that we don't really have a literature in Ireland on this topic. So there's a real dearth of research in the Irish context on this. One of our practice teachers and practice tutors, Ram, who you know, Prospera, is doing research in relation to the experience of Black and ethnic minority social workers more generally. But yeah, there's a lack of research in the Irish context. But I would imagine that a lot of these issues are very relevant to Ireland as well. And I think it's really important that we would learn from them and try to be able to address the issues, and I suppose almost assume in some ways that some of these issues are here, so that in the absence of knowledge to the contrary, or of literature that suggests the opposite. If anyone else has any other comments or thoughts?
Thanks, Miriam.
Any thoughts from anyone? They've quietened down compared to earlier.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Ram.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Ram.
Thanks for Prospera. Good morning, morning, everyone. It's Prospera's presentation so far resonates with the work I've done for 3.5 years. This is akin to what I have studied. So really, as Maren said, there is a dearth of studies in relation to Black students, Black practitioners, and more so students and practitioners from the other categories like the LGBT traveler community and so on and so forth. But really, people with disability and even younger. I've had practice students who are young, even younger than my own children, and from a practice educator perspective, and I mean, as a minoritized individual as well, I kind of identify with the issues that people in these categories experience with their experiences. So yeah, I think that validates what Maren and Prospera have noted.
Thanks, Ram.
Thank you. Thanks, Rom. Any others? What about from a practice perspective, though? If you think about the students that you've had and you've worked with in whatever capacity, whether practice educator or practice tutor, do you find, have any of the students who fit or identify as coming from those groups I've mentioned, or other groups indeed, have they said anything about their experiences? Have you witnessed anything? Have you observed anything? So I guess when anyone is faced with the data and the information that I've just presented, the next thing that kind of occurs to you is, so what? I know it's quite corny of me to also take Borton's reflective cycle, but anyway, so now you know the what, and now this is the so what. And so I feel from where I'm sitting that there is a picture that's beginning to emerge from the UK and from other places that's not encouraging. And perhaps you could also argue that it's in direct contradiction with the values of social work and our ethos and everything else that we hold dear, aka social justice. But I think what this also does is it places trainee practice educators as well as qualified ones in a terribly unenviable position where they have to try and change the status quo in order to, if you like, change, enhance, improve the experiences of the groups that we've just mentioned and the groups that are coming behind. Because don't forget that because things are so fluid, it's this today, what might it be tomorrow? But there's a core issue here of needing to disrupt whatever that looks like in practice education. I also acknowledge that the data that I've presented or the research that I've presented does not represent the entirety of practice educators. So I wouldn't want anyone to go away thinking, she's made some bold claims. I'm not making bold claims. I am stating what the research has found. And I do believe that there are small pockets of social workers or practice educators. However, we need to give the data, if you like, the findings, the credibility they deserve. And I think that one other key issue, one of the things that is on the learning outcomes for today is we need to think about oppression as requiring an element of power. Okay. And I think that once we do that, we will see that the role in itself is a powerful one, even if we don't think so ourselves. Our students, the learners that we work with, the people around them will constantly talk about the power inherent in this role. This is the power. You have the power to say pass or fail to the student. You have the power to ask the student to do some extra days. You have the power to review the written work and say it's not good enough. You have the power to make reasonable or unreasonable, quote unquote, adjustments. So we'll carry on and think about the so what. So there was enough going on for practice educators. There was enough going on for the world of social work. And then this happened. So one would think, gosh, we've got enough trying to demonstrate and live by our own principles of social justice, respect for human rights, respect for diversity. And then this happened. And so again, I want to give you the opportunity to really reflect on this. George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter, and B, the COVID-19 pandemic, which we continue to live through. I recognize that I think Miriam informed me, but I'd seen a lot of tweets a few months ago that there was a person in Ireland, wasn't there, also called George, who died at the hands of police brutality, if my understanding is right. But if we come back to this, and so that is unfortunate, what do you think these mean for practice education? Like I said, it just feels quite heavy, if I'm honest, that we already had issues that we hadn't completely resolved. We had issues that people denied. We had issues that were swept under the carpet in relation to oppressive practice and so on. And then this happened. And with these two particular areas, we need to stop and think about what they mean for practice education. So Miriam, if you're there, again, I'm going to give the opportunity for some reflections and thoughts about this. Well, the second one we've got a slide for, but I want to offer my thoughts on George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. And I just want to, in the book, sorry, this is the time, the only opportunity perhaps to plug the book. In the book, I've drawn some parallels between the police officers who were involved and practice educators. I say that because the leading police officer whose knee we saw was on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes plus, he was your practice educator, quote unquote. And there was a police trainee recruit with him who was watching, okay? This recruit who was watching obviously didn't do anything, couldn't do anything. And next week I'm doing a Social Work England, I'm doing a keynote and I'll be talking about that again. But the person the trainee police officer is your student. He was there to learn. He was there to watch and observe. Therefore, he didn't feel able to stop the police officer whose knee was on the neck of this poor man who ended up dying. The point I raise with this is we need to think about oppression in those circumstances. It's highly likely that the trainee police officer was oppressed by this person. Okay, I'm jumping the gun here and making some assumptions, but I need to call it what it is. But what kind of students are we preparing for the future? The ones that sit and watch while we oppress others, therefore they learn that that's okay? Or are we preparing students who can challenge us without feeling that they will be targeted? And so I really want us to think about it in that regard. And that's where the whole issue of power comes in. Now, if this trainee police officer did not feel that they were powerful enough to say, you need to stop it, but actually his response was, when they asked him in an interview, he said, it wasn't my role. So we are back to these ideas about when you have a student that you are supporting, yes, we do not want to see necessarily mini-me's. We don't want to see mini-me's, being churned out, but we hope that you will be able to demonstrate the stronger, more valuable, more approved parts of your practice. We're hoping that's what you're able to transfer to your student and their learning, not the part that makes them scared to challenge, keeps them quiet 24/7, and then enables you to get your work done and get them through the placement. So I have in the book, the Anti-Oppressive Practice book, towards the end, I have made the parallels with that. And I do think that it's an important one to think about, not just because George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and all of that, which we'll see in a minute, but also because of the power and the role of the police officer who did it. He did it in full view of this student. And so we need to think about that, and we need to almost give our students permission at the start. And you'll see how Mandela comes into that, almost give them permission at the start to say, I'm not perfect. If you find that I'm doing something or relating to a colleague or relating to service users that you feel uncomfortable about, of course, be careful how you kind of, let me know. Obviously don't come shouting but do it in a way that I will reflect on. So we need to start thinking about how exactly we would want our students to work with us. Now, closely linked to George Floyd is the COVID pandemic, but then we're talking more about economic and socioeconomic well-being in terms of the students and what they're able to do at this time. And I think I have a slide on that in a minute. So I like this, and I just took a screenshot, and I wanted to make the point that I think that the Irish Association of Social Workers has done great. Many skeptics would argue it's only a statement, we wait to see it in practice, but you know what? There are other associations that didn't make the statement. So, we're not trying to say, there's a hierarchy here of how good, you're either this or not. But what we're saying is this statement by your association is a step in the right direction. It says a lot about where you want to see practice move towards. It says a lot. It names George Floyd within it. It talks about Black people. It talks about minority ethnic colleagues. It talks about actions about people who devalue and stigmatize and discriminate. It's a strong statement. So I only put it there as a point to say, well done for this statement being made. And I think that all of us, the responsibility then falls on all of us to ensure that this doesn't just stay as a statement, but that the statement is converted into action and is actionable through our own practice with our students and our service users. So that was the point. That was the reason why I kind of put that in there. But if we look at the second issue, which was around the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, certainly in England, we know that, I've just written about this, I should know the statistics off the top of my head, but we know that the first 3,000 people who died of COVID, I think 89% or nearly 90% were from ethnic minority backgrounds. The data is there for a purpose. The data is there to tell us something. So if you have staff or students who are from ethnic minority backgrounds who are concerned about the risk to them on placement from COVID, I think these are legitimate considerations and legitimate conversations to have. A current paper that I'm writing really does demonstrate that students are continuing to struggle within the COVID situation where differential treatments are being received. And there's a book chapter that I produced on that. But some of these contemporary issues linked to COVID, and I've called them here pandemic-related practice learning issues, are around things like online and virtual placements, okay, assessing and supporting students, whether that's online, whether that's virtual, whether that's every day, whether that's a couple of days a week. And it's about how we do things virtually and how we do things from a distance that continues to uphold those values that we're talking about. So a student who genuinely cannot afford to be on the Zoom for 3 hours, the question should not be, well, you know, there's an enhanced version of Zoom. If you bought that, it would allow you 3 hours. I would not expect that to be part of a conversation that I would think is I wouldn't think it's an okay conversation to have. The only reason why I would think that's all right is if the student says, well, I've only got 30 minutes on my Zoom. Do you know anything about it? And then you're genuinely responding and saying, well, there's different packages, you know, there's this package that you have to pay for and so on. But I wouldn't expect your first comment to a student who says, I can't do an hour on Zoom. I don't expect the first comment to be, well, go purchase the longer version, you know, because we're not thinking then about people's particular circumstances in relation to financial and or class issues and or just general digital poverty. So I think that the pandemic has caused some of, you know, is giving us reason to consider some of these things. It's also making it slightly more complex to measure, and I use the word measure very loosely, developmental milestones for the student. What a student would have achieved in 2 weeks face-to-face, it's probably now taking them a month, okay? I think it's an interesting area, and I know that you will you may or may not agree, but I think that we cannot continue, the situation has changed so much, we cannot continue to use the old ways of working and expect them to fit with the new ways of working. Like I say, 2 weeks into a placement where they were physically there every day, you would expect a certain developmental move. If we don't find it, can we not try, you know, can we just try and be a bit more understanding? And again, these are some of the concerns that are coming out of the paper the research that I've been doing, thinking about these. And so again, it's something that I want to talk about, and I want you I would like you to kind of consider. And the whole digital poverty thing is really around practitioners and or students who don't have the right IT equipment, don't have the iPhone, can't do WhatsApp calling, you know, all of that kind of thing where they say to you, yes, I have a contract that's £18 a month. The contract finishes at about day 5 because my kids are, you know, using that internet as well. And it's just recognizing the diversity, because we're talking here about anti-oppression, we're talking across the board. It's just recognizing the diversity in terms of people's access to these kinds of things that for some of us are very normal. We wake up to internet, everyone can have 3 items on. You know, one child can have a phone on, an iPad on, a laptop, everything connected. And there's 4 of us in the house. So that's 4 times 4 devices. Everyone's happy. Nobody complains of shortage. But I won't be imposing that level, that conversation on my students, especially when they have come up and said to me, I am really struggling. And so we have to think about those in terms of that digital poverty and the differential treatment. So not being able to access the 2-hour-long YouTube video that you've asked the student to listen to before the next supervision may result in differential treatment. If you have more than one student, you'll say, well, Miriam did it. You know, come on, I gave the same thing to my other students. They've all gone and accessed this 2-hour YouTube video, you haven't. And so again, we're back to this idea of once we start to remember that our students are individual, we remember the position of power that we hold in allocating these kinds of tasks, then we begin to see where the differential treatment might be emerging for students and how they will experience that differential treatment based on what we're calling digital poverty and or access to material and other information. And then just kind of say that we often now, there's a big shift to courageous conversations. I know this is a term that's emerged from Australia. I think it's Liz Beddoe and Davies that, you know, talk about we need to have courageous conversations. in this context of COVID, George Floyd, all the changes, courageous conversations are absolutely needed, but courageous conversations are not oppressive. And so we need to make the distinction between really difficult conversations that you have to have, say, about developmental milestones for your student. That's a legit, I sound like my 19-year-old. That's a legitimate, let me say it properly, that's a legitimate concern about a student who's developing on placement. We want to see those developments, but we can have that conversation without going into oppressive stances, without taking an oppressive perspective on those concerns. Okay. Before I give you some time to kind of think about this, we're going to be doing this in a minute, just chatting about and reflecting on this. So from your own kind of practice learning handbook, which is really good, thanks for sending that through. So there's this Koru 2019 statement around your ethics, your conduct, codes of conduct and ethics. And it says, always consider the possible impact on service users and others before publishing any material, information, comments on social media, taking care to avoid abusive, unstable, unsustainable or defamatory comments. Okay, so that's from your own kind of handbook. So I think the comment then in terms of an anti-oppressive stance is, what would you do, or what would happen if you find a student liking or acknowledging, for example, homophobic comments on Twitter? I say that, I'll tell you why I'm asking this particular question once we've gone through. And the second question, depending on how you want to answer it, is what would you do if your student tweeted about taking part in the Black Lives Matter protest at the weekend? Going to move on. So thank you for those contributions. I think I will leave that one with you as a university, as a course team, to look at and perhaps think about how, you know, how we might progress from those points. Before we look at the Mandela model as perhaps a helpful or useful tool, I just kind of want to share with you this definition of oppression from Barker. It's one that I absolutely love. It speaks to me in very different ways, and I'm hoping it will speak to you. You may have your own definition of oppression that you prefer, but this really does speak to me. And all the ones in red, those are my emphases. I'm making all the emphasis on these things. So according to Barker, oppression is the social act of placing severe restrictions on an individual, group, or institution. Typically, these restrictions are placed formally or covertly on oppressed groups so that they may be, exploited and less able to compete with other social groups. The oppressed individual or group is devalued, exploited, and deprived of privileges by the individual or the group that has more power. So you can see where the thoughts of power come in, but you can also see the issue about severe restrictions. You can also see that these are not only covert, they're also formal. So when we talked about the institutional type of things, that's what that's about. And people who then are oppressed are exploited and less able to compete. And this comes to mind when you start looking at the differential experiences of the diversity of people undertaking social work programs. So there's some particular groups that are so exploited that they're not able to compete. They seem to be failing, but they seem to be failing because those severe restrictions have been placed on them, either by the university, by the placement, by the practice educator, and so on and so forth. But what is more is that these groups or these individuals are devalued, exploited, and deprived of privileges. So where we start talking about devaluing people, you know, we start thinking about our role. What can we do if this is the definition of oppression that we want to go with? What can we do to ensure that A, we don't oppress, whether that's our students or our service users, but how do we explain this to our students so they don't do it or they avoid oppressing others? And I definitely believe that the best way to do this is through a relationship-based approach, which many of you use in different guises. I'm going to probably whiz through the model, the Mandela model, and I won't tell you too much about it because, yes, I developed it in 2012, but again, it was all around, I was just really sick and tired of the Black students failing, poorer attainment, taking longer to graduate, you know, graduating with lower outcomes and so on, and then going into work and struggling, and it was just, it was all a bit too much. But for those who know me, I moan a bit and then I have to do. I don't moan forever. I always have a point where I'm like, no, enough is enough. I've got to move on. So I hypothesized at the time that there seemed to be relationship difficulties between students and their practice, Black students specifically, and their practice educators. And I argued that that was perhaps why they were appearing to do, well, not appearing, they were doing less well in all those studies that I've just talked to you about. So very quickly then, the Mandela model, this is what it looks like. It's a cyclical model, and it's a mnemonic that stands for making time, acknowledge needs, differences, educational experiences, life experiences, and age. And the reason why it's cyclical is obviously because our lives are not linear. Our lives change. And so I'm just going to talk you through how this model, I mean, in the university that I left, in the University of Northampton, we actually, well, I created a social work supervision format from this model, and practice educators were using it. Not that practice educators need any more paperwork, because you have enough. You don't need any more formats, you have enough. But what practice educators honestly said was, how do we enter conversations? How do you enter conversation with a student and develop this relationship-based practice when they never really want to talk to you? Their answers are monosyllabic, yes, no, thank you. How do we enter these conversations? So remembering that the whole idea of the Mandela model was focused on Black African students and trying to find some kind of way of empowering and supporting them to do better, I decided that this was quite an important way to do it. So just very quickly, I think making time is just so important. If you don't have time to be a practice educator, you're going to be oppressing somebody, because you're going to be giving them substandard or less than satisfactory supervision time. You're going to be putting pressure on them to complete work. You don't have enough time. You're going to be rushing from meeting to meeting without full consideration and reflection on what you've been doing and the students learning. So making time is the most important thing. How much time do you have as a practice educator? How much time does your student need? Again, in the spirit of trying to be anti-oppressive, you don't give Rom the same hour and a half as you give Prospera if Prospera needs more. Prospera seems to be the weaker student, but you're giving her exactly the same time as Rom. And actually, Rom probably needs half the time. So how do we work in ways that it's not a one size fits all? It's student A needs an hour and a half a week. Student B, I can meet them an hour and a half every fortnight because they're at different places. In this a relationship focused process, you know, how do we make time with regard to COVID? Online and telephone, where's that time coming from when people are still very busy? Where is the time going to come from if you're expecting students to be online at particular times every week? So making time is really important. And don't forget that this model, hopefully...
Hi, Irene, how are you?
Oops.
Just
This model is also helping us to model, if you like, good behavior and good practice with our service users. So what we're doing with our students is, right, this is good to do. You can use this with your service users. So we're going to, from the making time, which is the M, we're going to acknowledge the needs. What are the students' personal needs? Learning needs, additional learning needs, team need, organizational needs, COVID-related needs, Black Lives Matter needs. What are their needs? Do they need adjustments to their seating? Do they need adjustments because they have childcare situation? They don't drive. What are those needs? They need acknowledging. Because I can tell you that sometimes when you wait for students to tell you what the issues are, and I know some of you have been doing this for years, you'll never hear that there's no need. The student's there to do the work. They're never going to share that with you. If we use a Mandela framework or a relationship-based framework, you're more likely to get these conversations going naturally. And then you have the discussions around difference. So in England, when we talk about anti-oppressive practice in supervision, we have the open conversations, right? I'm a Black female of African origin. You are a white female of, and then you tell me, British, British heritage, English heritage. Okay, once we've struck that, we're going to have to think about that, because those differences manifest in our approach to things and understanding the world. When I go to see a family, I bring my Black Africanness with me. I do not call their food smelly. I do not call their rooms overcrowded. I do not call their men aggressive. But how does that differ when I go to shadow you, or you come to shadow me to look at my practice? And you go, Rom, you did not make that comment about the state of the house. You didn't say anything about how smelly it was. And Rom says to you, well, actually, I cook those foods every day in my house, if you want to call my house smelly. So differences are important because they help us as practice educators see the world from which students are coming from, and which therefore helps us. I've made a list here: gender, disability, social class, race, sexuality, faith, religion, and so on and so forth. How does a Catholic family operate, and how differently do they operate to a Muslim family? Will you be turning up on a Friday when the Muslim family are at the mosque or don't want to see you? Because Sunday is a weekend, so you won't be turning up at a service user's house unless you're out of hours, a social worker, on a Sunday. So it's recognizing those differences and having those honest conversations. Back to the questions that I posed earlier. This is the opportunity sometimes for students to say, this is the first time I will be working in an area that has Black people. I've never really worked with Black people before. This is an honest opportunity then for you as the practice educator to have those conversations about what their learning needs might be, what they can go and read about, what they can go and watch in order to ensure that they demonstrate the right values on placement. We think about educational experiences, and they're very important. And we're talking about social work students. So we have to think about those educational experiences. We've seen a growing number of social work students, especially the ones doing master's programs, coming from different academic backgrounds, accounting, law, and so on. All of these are valuable and valued background learning. But we have found, certainly in our study in England, we have found that practice educators turn their noses down at particular areas of learning for particular students, but then it's a good thing if it's another student. I'll just give you an example. So a student failed their placement. The other thing I didn't mention at the start of this was that I get called to do what we call second opinions. I don't know whether you have them in Ireland. So when a student has failed, I get the whole, and the student appeals the failure, I get the whole portfolio and I get to look at it and offer a view. And on one occasion, the student was a law graduate who had come to do social work as a master's. So in the area that she was working, she was really heavy on the law and the legal side of things, to which her practice educator said, you know, you're too arrogant because you think you have legal training. And this was a Black student. But to another student who had a degree in, I think it was finance, he says, oh, you know, that finance degree is really useful. It helps you to support practice. It helps you to support service users with their budgeting skills. So this student, this Black student, had captured all of that and said, just look at the differential treatment. My previous law degree was referred to as I'm arrogant. I look at everything from a law perspective, yet my colleague's finance background was looked at really positively. And she was told, well, yeah, you can do some budgeting with some of our service users. So we need to recognize educational experiences, previous and current, and what the changes have been due to the pandemic. How has the pandemic changed academic endeavors for students? What kind of assignments are they bringing to you on placement? How are they learning? What are they learning? And actually, what stake has the family got in the education? So in some cultures, the degree belongs to the whole family or community. In others, it's a very individualized, I get the degree, it's mine, nobody cares. So it's recognizing that within the context of this model. Life experiences, you know, are really important. Opening conversations with students, you know, the open question like, you know, so tell me about what brought you to social work. Okay, it's a really good opening question, and you can start understanding where the student is coming from in that regard. And I make reference to the points that have been made around context. Context is absolutely vital, but also when we have these conversations, sometimes we're able to say, well, okay, although they had some grasp of what they wanted to do social work for, I'm not quite sure, or I think that they might need support in X, Y, and Z. And so that is a good opening conversation. Our students, like us, have lives, like we rightly said, and some of their lives are spent on social media 24/7, but they have lives where the ill health, wealth, poverty, bereavement, war, relocation are factors in these lives. And therefore, how do we understand those life experiences within the context of what we're trying to do with them and how we're trying to work with students? And it's cyclical. The model is cyclical because a student can start working with you and they're not a parent. Partway through the placement, they become a parent. What does that mean for acknowledging needs? Do they now subsequently need days off? Do they need caring leave? They may not have had a diagnosis when they started placement with you. Partway through the placement, they have a diagnosis. How does your placement support and meet those new needs in terms of life experiences? And very importantly, and specifically because I was writing for the Black African community, age is an absolutely significant area of analysis. You don't need to ask the student how old they are. They don't need to ask you how old you are. But does age matter, and what are the implications? Sometimes the deference that students will demonstrate if they feel that the practice educator is older is significant and is important to understand. And when I say the deference, I mean situations where the student does not offer challenges to the practice educator, does not change what they're saying, does not understand perhaps historical perspectives in relation to the cases that you're asking them to work with, because they're perhaps not that old and they don't understand. And a typical example was when I first developed this, a few students said to me, everyone's talking about this Mandela. I looked it up and apparently it's a person. So, that was my first kind of thoughts around, well, you can't make assumptions that everybody knows or was around or was alive or was old enough when Nelson Mandela was in power or was working. So I know that feels like a whistle-stop tour of that, and the reason why it's there is obviously you can use it in whichever ways. I feel that there are a number of theoretical underpinnings in relation to the Mandela model, but for today I'm only going to stick to relationship-based practice because that's what the conversation is about in relation to anti-oppressive practice. But underpinning it is also critical theories, strengths-based practice, person-centered, and ecological systems theory. So I don't need to kind of rehearse this stuff here about Mandela and relationship-based practice. You know and do relationship-based practice. But I'll just draw your attention to the final point here, which is that the student-PE relationship should be based on trust and respect. And so with that in mind, we know full well that part of our role as practice educators is to encourage that. I will spend a bit more time on this slide because, again, this is evidence about the importance of relationship-based practice. So whether you use Mandela or not is not the issue. The issue is about getting to know the student in ways that show respect and that ultimately mean that you perhaps will not be making assumptions about their abilities or inabilities or difficulties. And I start with Everett, who says that in terms of that relationship-based practice, for us, it is the relationship between us and our students within the supervisory relationship. So Everett says, supervision is more than a professional activity. It is also a personal relationship requiring a great deal of investment of time, knowledge, skill, and commitment. So we're coming back to the making time. If you don't have time, this is going to be really difficult. I also want to reference Lever 2005, who, again, writing from an English perspective, I think these are the challenges of working from home. My doorbell's gone. Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry, everyone. Someone's just come back.
We all want to know who's there now.
Kevin, it's my little boy. He's just come back from school. Yeah. So where are we? So Lever talks about, again, from an English perspective, she says, look, where you have a good relationship with your PE or, with your student, they're more likely to accept a fail outcome. Okay, because there's trust there. Your student hopefully believes that you mean well. However, the opposite is also true, that if you don't have a good relationship with your student, then they're more likely to see a fail as an indictment. They're more likely to challenge it. They're more likely to complain. They're more likely to raise concerns of racism, homophobia, etc., etc., etc. And then, of course, my doctoral thesis talks about the power imbalance and says if there is a power imbalance or the relationship is poor, you have no voice as the student. But also, practice educators tended to leave issues of failing right to the very end, where there was absolutely no way the student could make up for it. And so again, this speaks to the dynamic of power that we were talking about, that I mentioned earlier, that if we're looking to develop if we're looking to work anti-oppressively, then we need to think about how power infiltrates these spaces. Okay. It feels like we have a lot to go, but we don't. I think it's just a number of reference slides. So hopefully I can get this next section done pretty quickly. I'm not going to go through all of this, but what I tried to present on this slide is give us a thought about the processes that we go through with our students. And they may be called different things where you work, but there's some steps that every placement team will go through: placement matching, profile CV to PE's response, initial meeting, placement planning meeting, induction, supervision, and so on and so forth until the end of placement. What I'm hoping that we will do going forward is to really stop and think about these processes and think about where oppressive practice could creep in into any of these processes. Because as practice educators, we sometimes see this as a whole. It's the student's placement. That's what we call it, the student's placement. But the student's placement is made up of those steps. And not only is it made up of those steps, at each step might involve different people. And so it's absolutely crucial that we think about, oh my gosh, how do I think oppression can, feed into this? And I give an example from a study I did, I think in 2014, where a student took her written work and the practice educator literally in front of her crumpled it, threw it in the bin, kind of did a shot like a hoop and said, that's where it belongs. I mean, I'm really not sure that people should be doing that. I mean, it just feels like the most demotivating, disrespectful way to do anything to anyone, let alone a student. So I'm giving that example of kind of extreme use of power, where somebody's writing can just be crumpled and thrown, chucked in the bin and tell the student that's where it belongs. So let's think about all of these points: the grade and the outcome, the decision meeting, how we speak to our students, how we speak to our students in their presence, how we speak to the students behind their backs. All of this matters. And those so-called banter conversations that we have over coffee about, oh my God, that student, she's so needy. Those are conversations that you may think you're having with a friend, with a colleague, with a peer. But again, we come back to institutions, that you must feel really comfortable to say that in your institution. And so what does that tell us about institutionalized forms of oppression? It means it's all right to walk around the kitchen, talking about a student in that way. And again, some of us approach this differently. You might say, oi, that's a bit, not great to speak about students that way. Or I might just walk past it. Are we contributing to that oppression, or are we making it better by just completely avoiding the conversation about, how you spoke about your student the other day? So let's look at these processes with our students and think about how some of these oppressive practices come into play. Okay. Just very quickly, the barriers that I have found through my research, the barriers to oppressive practice in a practice learning setting really is around organizational culture, like I said before, which sometimes frustrates fair practice. So for example, the easiest example, the one that I've come up against over and over again, is reasonable adjustments. A student needs reasonable adjustments to undertake a placement, and there's a tussle between who's responsible. Is it the university? Is it the placement? Is it the university? Is it the placement? Hey people, we're week 7 now. Come on, let's get with the program. What exactly is happening to that student? 7 weeks of a tussle between who's supposed to get that chair and who's supposed to make those adjustments surely is not anti-oppressive practice for that student. Again, an organization where we delay, we avoid, we delegate issues of concern, where there's no strict and straight formal grievance procedure. And these are the ones that I often call, so I'll say, you know, is that to frustrate the process? Clearly your grievance procedure isn't straightforward because you don't want people complaining, because you tell them it's going to take 6 months to resolve, by which time they should be qualified anyway. And so what are we doing institutionally? So there's a lot there about institutional discrimination. If you've got poor or weak conflict management procedures, that can be organizational, or it can be individual. We have got some people who are just risk averse. They're not going to get into an argument with anyone. Therefore, if they have a student of diversity where there's an issue and they say, oh, please, Rom, can you take it further? It sits with Rom. She's not taking it anywhere, but she's not going to tell you either. You know, she may blame the institution. You know, oh, well, I did tell the directors, but they've not come back to me. How many times do we hear that? And how many students are bold enough to go, can I have that director's name, please? Which director did you speak to? Can I see a copy of the email? Our students do not generally feel able to ask those questions and challenge in those ways. In relation to intersectional experiences, of course, where you're a woman, but you're a Black woman, maybe from a poor socioeconomic background, then we have what we're calling you're overexposed, but you're underprotected. So you're overexposed, you turn left, it's about being a woman, you turn right, it's about being Black, you look under the chair, it's about being disabled. So there's all these intersectional identities that then create an additional issue for us, but then we are underprotected. We are underprotected because am I going to put in a grievance about racism? Am I going to put it about disablism? And am I going to put it in about sexism? Which one? And sometimes students with those intersectional experiences, poor intersectional experiences, don't know where to take it. And the systems will say, yeah, if you can't name it racism, sexism, or this, we're going to call it, what's the one that I heard? I had such a good laugh. We're going to call it dignity at work procedures. You can't be racist to me and just tell me to call it dignity at work. This is beyond dignity at work protocols. But because students could not appropriately identify the box that the organization wanted, it was classed as a dignity at work issue rather than a racist one, a sexist one, and so on and so forth. I will give you a chance to come in. I want to get this over and done with, and then we can have a few minutes reflection. How do we as practice educators enable an anti-oppressive learning environment? So what do we do actively, not just sitting down and hoping and praying that it's going to work? I suspect that being an ally is a good way to start. And when we talk about allies, people immediately want to start thinking about race, but no, being an ally actually does involve supporting people favorably from varying backgrounds and social locations. In my recent study, the students said, well, just talk to us, find out what we have to say, just talk to us, just, you know, speak to us. And so I then say, we know that the key to successful supporting students, enabling them develop professional identity, we have to invest time in building and developing a secure and honest relationship. And that's a quote from Dorr. But also one of my suggestions to Miriam, yourself and your team is we need to start maintaining a log or a database of students and their PEs, especially where there have been concerns about oppressive behaviors. If these are the people that are going to be the face of our profession, i.e. the oppressive practice educators, we don't want them. I know there's a shortage of practice educators across the world and they're like gold dust, but if all they're going to do is oppress our students, not support them, whittle them down until they have 0 to nothing confidence, then actually they're doing the profession more harm than good. You can offer training maybe as the first step. And if that doesn't work, you can hopefully say goodbye to practice educators like that. I think this is the final, no, okay, last but one. We're not going to do this activity. I'm going to ask you to think about it in your own time. And it was just a snapshot of something that I've dealt with. What do you make of this final PE report, which starts off as, Janet obviously is not the right name. Janet started placement on the 10th of March in the XXX team. She was slow to grasp the work of the team and her role as a student social worker. She was unprepared for placement and for the first few weeks would leave at 4 p.m, saying she had completed the required hours stated by the university. The situation gradually improved, and by week 5, Janet had started to work on her own and with colleagues. That's an opening of a final PE report. I'm sure these are loose. I'm sure people can write what they want. I'm sure there's a format, but I'm sure that people can, in terms of the language they use, they can. But I use this because I really want to show how, if you've got to week 15 or whatever and the student has passed, surely you can wait a few paragraphs in before you kind of outline this slow to grasp with no evidence to support it. You know, what does that mean? Is she generally slow to grasp? Has she got something, a disability, an additional need that made her slow? And, you know, was she wrong for leaving at 4 p.m? That's what the university told her. So I have some concerns. I have a few of these that I use on training and I get people to critique them, but I'm asking that we think about this. And there's a real kind of difference between how practice teachers write about female students and how they write about male students. Now, that's another thing that's emerging, you know, and so we need to be able to think about this within the wider context of anti-oppressive practice. I think this is probably it now. Yes, good. We're nearly there. So our role as practice educators, obviously, we're really happy. We're cool. The students graduate and we're like, yeah, the job is done. But I would just want to kind of end by saying, even after qualifying, there are particular groups of students who continue now as qualified practitioners to experience a great deal of discrimination and oppression. So in 2020, Samuel talks about more ethnic minority students referred to fitness to practice panels. Okay, and the panel membership is 80% white. So that's from an English perspective. Carter, very recently, 2021, also reported that newly qualified social workers, so we call them NQSWs, from Black, Asian, and ethnic minority backgrounds, as well as those with disabilities, experience disproportionate problems in passing the ASYE. So our ASYEs, you know, when you qualify, you have a year in assessed practice, and we use what we call a practice mentor at that point, not a practice educator, practice mentor. And we're saying that students with disabilities and Black students are failing or not passing. And the people who, the practice mentors, are practice educators who work with undergraduates, but once they qualify, we call them when they're doing the work with qualified practitioners, we call them practice assessors. So I hate to break it to you, it just shows that there's a throughput of some practice educators beginning with students at a particular level, and it just carries all the way through until they're actually qualified and beyond. So, we have a lot of insecurities, not just as individuals, globally. There's a lot going on there. But this is, and because of fear mongering and fake news and whatever news, it is even more crucial that social workers engage with agendas that are collaborative, inclusive, and respectful of diversity. We are the role models to our students, but we are also the gatekeepers to the profession. So today was not an attempt to encourage PEs or practitioners to just pass students, any old student, in the name of, you know, being anti-oppressive. Instead, what I wanted to talk about today was to highlight how easy it is to talk about anti-discriminatory, anti-oppressive practice while forgetting that these are key ingredients in the practice educator-student relationship. And I'm going to end with one of my own quotes, which is that minimal learning occurs when student energy goes into maintaining professionalism whilst navigating persistent acts of oppression in field placements.
Thank you so much, Prospera. That was fantastic. I'm just going to stop the recording and then we'll have hopefully a few minutes for questions.